unabashed,
the most unpredictable,
becomes a headline,
the most volatile,
outrageous behavior,
unsubstantiated narratives, a battle of personalities.
Welcome to Grant Tamasha, a co-production of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace and the Hindustan Times. I'm your host, Milan. Joanna Slater was the Washington Post India bureau chief based in New Delhi from 2018 to 2021. She was posted in Delhi during one of the most consequential periods in recent Indian history, covering the 2019 general elections, the abrogation of Article 370 in Kashmir, the COVID-19 pandemic, the Pegasus hacking revelations, and much, much more. Prior to joining the Post, she worked at Canada's Globe and Mail, the Wall Street Journal, and the Far Eastern Economic Review, reporting from more than 20 countries during her career. To talk about her tenure in New Delhi and what she learned on the job, Joanna joins me today from Williamstown, Massachusetts. Joanna, thanks for coming on the show.
Thanks so much for having me.
So I told you several months ago that I wanted to have you on the podcast because I thought it might be fun and interesting to have a sort of exit interview with you after your stint in Delhi came to an end. You have been reporting on some of the biggest stories in India and across South Asia, really. And as the Washington Post bureau chief resident in Delhi, you're sort of, uniquely positioned to reflect on the job as a reporter in, the quote unquote new India. So let me just ask you about your own history with India. Your most recent sojourn with the Post was not your first rodeo, as they say, in India. Tell us a bit about how you first got to the country, what you ended up doing there.
Sure, absolutely. This was not my first rodeo, as you rightly point out. I first came to India as a journalist back in 2000, the year 2000. I had been living in Hong Kong and working for a wonderful magazine called the Far Eastern Economic Review. Perhaps some of your readers will remember it. It no longer exists, unfortunately, but it was a weekly news magazine, like a regional version of Time or Newsweek, and home to some amazing journalists. And for a number of reasons, I got it in my mind that I wanted to go to India. And I will be forever grateful to the then editor of the magazine, Nayan Chanda, for sending me at the age of 25 to Mumbai. I was based there for 4 years for the Far Eastern Economic Review and the Wall Street Journal. And I began learning Hindi. I developed a lifelong obsession with Swati snacks. Perhaps some of your listeners will also be familiar with that restaurant.
Yeah, a personal favorite of mine as well.
And I ended up meeting the man who would become my husband at the end of that stint there on the set of a Bollywood movie. So I definitely got the India bug a long time ago.
So you just kind of, buried the lead there, which you're not supposed to do as a reporter. The set of a Bollywood movie. Could you just elaborate for 1 second about what was that?
Sure. So to make a long story short, I was an extra on the set of Mangal Pandey, The Rising, the Aamir Khan movie. And my husband played a small role in the movie as well. And that's where we met. He's also an American who has spent a lot of time in India. So it was unexpected.
Wow. Okay. So this is a proper Bollywood love story in all of its meanings. So you came back to India, of course, this most recent time in 2018. So quite a bit. There was a gap between your two postings there. Tell us a little bit about how you kind of saw India. How had things changed between those two visits? I mean, were there things out there that really struck you as saying like, "Wow, this is different from what I remembered," or there's something new going on here? What did you take in?
Of course, you hesitate to generalize about any country, let alone one as large and varied as India. But I will try. And of course, I noticed differences and changes in the 14 years. Since I had been in India as a journalist. I actually had spent a year in India in 2011-12. We can talk about that later, but I was not there as a journalist. I was actually on maternity leave. So one of the things that I noticed, and this may seem basic, but you could certainly see the very tangible results of a period of extended, accelerated economic growth. There were not Porsche SUVs driving around Delhi when I was there, 15 years earlier. Maybe they were not SUVs in general, but you get my point. New infrastructure, airports, highways, The kebab stand I used to frequent was now a chain with nearly a dozen outlets. So you saw things like that. Of course, politically, the changes were also very striking. During my first stint in India from 2000 to 2004, the government was also led by the BJP. Atal Bihari Vajpayee was the prime minister. And I had actually interviewed Prime Minister Modi back when he was chief minister of Gujarat. So his ascent to the post of prime minister was surprising for someone whose frame of reference was the 2000 to 2004 period, as was the ascent of Hindu nationalism itself. Hindu nationalism, Hindu majoritarianism is now very much the air that India breathes. It's matter of fact, it's taken for granted. And that was not the case back when I lived there in the early 2000s. And we can talk about this, that trend, continued in very striking ways during the last 3 years in particular. I would also add that for me as a journalist, the openness to the press and to the foreign media had changed dramatically in that time period. My most recent, in the last 3 years, I was able to speak with, spokespeople for the BJP and certain members of parliament, but the same was really not true for members of the cabinet. And back when I was based in Mumbai and spending a lot of time in Delhi, I interviewed many members of Vajpayee's cabinet, including, I think, pretty much everyone except Vajpayee himself. And that was not the case this time.
So I want to just pause for a second to ask you a few questions about kind of life as a journalist. I've spoken with other foreign correspondents who have spent time in India from, leading newspapers in the world, and they've kind of talked about their difficulties in getting real stories into the print editions of their newspapers. And what they've often said is, look, India is not Afghanistan or Pakistan. It's not a locus of global conflict, nor is India, Russia, or China, which are seen as major competitors to the United States. What was your experience like at the Post in this regard? Was it hard sometimes to convince editors to say, like, look, this is a really important story and you may not think so, but here's why?
Thankfully, we didn't have difficulties getting our stories into print. They may not have always gone where we wanted them to go. Of course, every journalist thinks nearly every one of their stories belongs on the front page. But I definitely acknowledge your point. I think India can be a bit of a conundrum for mainstream American newspapers. As you said, it's not China or Russia, a once or future antagonist, nor is it Afghanistan or Pakistan, which obviously represent geopolitical problems of a different nature. And I think this was particularly true during the Trump years, right? So the intersection of the Trump administration and Putin's regime or policy toward China were just giant stories. And India didn't emerge in the same way on Trump's radar. I think probably fortunately so for the country. And, when that changed, when Modi went to Texas or when Trump came to Ahmedabad, we covered the daylights out of, those stories. One of the things I have wondered is whether perhaps on some level, India and the United States are too similar in certain ways. They're the world's two largest democracies, which tend to view themselves as the center of their respective universes. So perhaps it's hard to make room for kind of a real life version of either country in the other one's media.
That's interesting. I mean, I hadn't thought about that way, but I think it's, sometimes when you're in the United States, there is a story that we become obsessed with, and we just think that everyone else in the world cares, and it can be very inside baseball. And I think you can have that sometimes in India too, right? So I remember talking to journalists around the time of Jayalalitha's corruption trials, right, and then later her passing away, and this was just like this iconic woman who just, like, the story wrote itself, right? It was so dramatic in so many ways, but just, how do you actually package that up for an international audience, right? It's not immediately obvious. Like, okay, like, I get why she's important in India, but why should we care?
Absolutely. These are the challenges. And I think for democracies in particular, we find our own process stories endlessly fascinating. and it's sometimes hard to translate those to other audiences. I mean, of course, when you have a personality like, Jayalalitha, then at some point, definitely we're going to find a way to write about it. But the kind of developments and the obsessing over the twists and turns, that can be hard to translate.
Let me circle back to something that you alluded to earlier. There are many journalists. They represent domestic outlets. They represent foreign outlets. But they work in India, and they commonly jointly sort of lament the shrinking space for independent media, growing government censorship, or if not outright censorship, backlash if you cross them or criticize them. And of course, the lack of access to government officials. You sort of mentioned that earlier. Tell us a little bit about your experience the last couple of years trying to cover Indian politics and the government in particular.
Well, I will reiterate what I said before about the lack of access to government officials, which I think speaks to a centralization of power and a real fear among government officials of saying the wrong thing. You have a prime minister who has yet to hold a real press conference and whose practice is to grant interviews only to friendly outlets. So that kind of sets the tone for the interaction with the media. As you mentioned, there are very disturbing developments underway in India's media landscape. These are well documented pressure on various outlets, on individual journalists, criminal cases filed for reporting, and now a new set of IT rules that could be used to muzzle critical coverage. And all of this is focused primarily on the Indian media, obviously, but the foreign media is certainly not immune. I received some strongly worded complaints about our coverage, which is obviously, it's absolutely the government's right. I would argue it may not necessarily be effective in the way it's conveyed. But one thing I do want to highlight, and I think people may not realize how important this is India has placed some real restrictions on the movement of foreign correspondents. This may not have come up in a very obvious way, but Kashmir is effectively off limits for foreign journalists, as is much of the Northeast. The government has implemented a permit regime whereby foreign journalists have to apply for permission to travel to Kashmir. Before we started recording, you said that I used to cover the Northeast. I wish I had been able to cover the Northeast of India, but I was not granted permission to travel there. These are restrictions that you might expect to see maybe in a place like China. I don't think India really wants to be in this category, and the restrictions make no sense. If I'm a foreign tourist, I can get on a plane to Srinagar. If I'm an Indian journalist, I can get on a plane to Srinagar. But if I'm a foreign journalist, I'm technically violating the terms of my visa if I do that without permission. So that's a real problem for all of us in the international media in India. There has been a sense lately as well that at times visa renewals and the length of visa renewals is connected to a perception of whether your coverage is seen as overly critical. So again, there are disturbing developments in that regard.
Let me ask you about this coverage question, because I've seen this a lot with the New York Times. A lot of Indians do outrage about the editorial stance of the New York Times edit page. And I'm wondering, the Post has had some hard-hitting editorials about India as well, criticizing backsliding, constraints on freedom of expression, many of the issues you just alluded to. Were people in India, particularly those in government, right, do you think they're able to separate out the kind of editorial line of the page versus the news reporting that you and your colleagues do?
I think people in positions of power in India, like in the United States, know that there's a wall between the news side of the business and the opinion side. Of course, that's sometimes difficult to see, particularly online. I don't think people on social media know that there's a difference between the news side and the opinion side. The truth is, I did not and do not know what our columnists or editorial writers are doing, and they did not know what my colleague Neha Mussy and I were writing, and that's just the way it works. So I try to explain that to people, and hopefully that message eventually gets through.
Hey, Grant Tamasha listeners. Thanks for listening to the podcast. Putting this show together each week is a labor of love, but it takes a lot of work to put out a great show every week. If you'd like to support the work we do at Grant Tamasha, please visit ceip.org/donate. Don't forget to subscribe to us on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, or on your favorite podcasting platform, so you'll be the first to know when a new episode rolls out. I want to ask you about some of the big stories, Joanna, that you had the chance to cover. And I want to start with the 2019 election. Obviously, this was a monumental thing for all of us who follow India to kind of watch unfold. You had a piece in the Post that came out, I think it was the first day of polling. And the headline, which of course you don't write, just to be clear, the headline was, "In the world's biggest election, India's Narendra Modi pushes fear over hope." And, I think it was a common sort of sentiment that we saw in many headlines of the time. It was in some sense an inversion of the 2014 campaign, which was about hope and change, right? To kind of to borrow some phrases from American elections. Tell us a little bit about what the atmosphere was like in the run up to that election. Was that sense of kind of fear or foreboding, was it palpable?
So the election campaign unfolded very much in the shadow of the attack in Pulwama in Kashmir, which killed 40 Indian soldiers. This was a devastating terrorist attack, the worst in decades. So certainly there was a sense of fear, a sense of being under attack, a sense of anger, a sense of a desire for retribution and revenge. And the government retaliated. They carried out an airstrike on what they said was a militant training camp in Pakistan, in Balakot. So there was certainly both a reflection of fear and a desire to project strength in response to that fear and that perceived threat. That was very much the environment in which the campaign unfolded. And this is, in many ways, as we know, the BJP's wheelhouse. So this is where they tend to be very effective in conveying these kinds of messages. I remember seeing a billboard in Uttar Pradesh which had Modi's face and the words "penetrated Indian territory." Penetrated enemy territory and attacked terrorists. So that's both an expression of a kind of muscular national power and a reflection of fear at the same time. And I remember speaking to someone at a rally for Modi around the same time who basically said this, who said something like, "I don't need jobs or roads, but we want our country free from fear." So there was definitely that atmosphere at that time.
So, talking about mix of strength and fear, fast forward a few months, and we come to Modi's decision in August of 2019 to nullify Article 370 of the Constitution. And you had a piece out the very next day in which you said, quote, "If there was any question about the seriousness of Modi's intent to transform the world's largest democracy, such doubts vanished last week," end quote. But beyond the substance of the move itself, you also noted that the way Modi executed the decision on Kashmir indicates what his quote-unquote new India might look like. So without getting into the merits of Article 370, what do you think we learned about the new India, as you put it, and as Modi talks of it himself, from the way in which Article 370, that decision, was implemented?
The abrogation of Article 370 was a stunning moment, perhaps not unexpected, but nevertheless stunning. And I think the way in which it was carried out is telling. So it was carried out without consultation with the people who are most affected by it without consulting Kashmiris or Kashmiri leaders. So I think that's a hallmark now of some of this government's most dramatic policy moves. And also, it's a move whose constitutionality is still unclear. This government doesn't seem to feel constrained in those types of ways either. We have a state that was bifurcated and downgraded to a union territory. And it's the latter part of that that even now I find hard to believe. That kind of demotion has never occurred in independent India, as far as I'm aware. And we have yet to know whether that's okay according to the Indian constitution. We just don't really know. And this government has made it clear that it's going to embrace these kind of top-down tactics and maybe make decisions, implement plans, and wait and see if there are any challenges later. And if we've learned anything, I think, from the last 3 years, is that those challenges, at least from independent institutions, are not likely to emerge.
You know, the downgrading of the union territory status is one thing, but there's also the pitch which the government has made of essentially, if you get in line, we might upgrade you back to being a state, right? So it's clearly a move that's infused with kind of political import, right? Not just an administrative measure by any means. One of the biggest stories that you covered during your entire time at the Post was the Pegasus project. And this was not a Post story per se. It was a global collaboration of multiple media organizations. Could you sort of tell us, for the uninitiated who maybe didn't read your dispatches, what the India angle to this larger global story was?
The Pegasus project originated with Forbidden Stories, which is a French journalism nonprofit, and Amnesty International. And they had access to a list of 50,000 phone numbers, mobile phone numbers all over the world that were possible targets of surveillance by a form of spyware that's called Pegasus. It's made by NSO Group, an Israeli company. And NSO Group says that it sells this tool only to governments for to be used to prevent crimes like terrorism and drug trafficking. So our aim was to investigate whether this spyware was actually being used in that way. And our global investigation showed that all over the world, governments were using this spyware to surveil journalists, activists, opposition politicians, among others. So basically, it is not being used in the way that the company and government say it's being used. The Washington Post was one of 17 media organizations involved in investigating this list, and there was an Indian partner in that group, The Wire, with whom we worked very closely. On the list that I mentioned, there were more than 1,000 Indian mobile phone numbers. So our job was to figure out who those numbers belonged to and then persuade people to let us analyze their phones to determine if they had indeed been successfully targeted. So The Wire did the vast lion's share of this work and verified more than 300 of the numbers on the list that were Indian numbers. And when the story was published in July, we had been able to do forensic analyses on actual devices on 22 smartphones in India whose numbers appeared on the list. And that analysis showed that 10 of them had been successfully targeted with Pegasus, or had been targeted with Pegasus, excuse me. And some of the results were inconclusive because the phones were Android. The tools that we had worked much better with iPhones. It's very hard to find the traces of these infections on Android phones. And the confirmed targets included journalists like Sushant Singh, formerly of the Indian Express, and Prashant Kishore, a very well-known political strategist. So these are not "quote unquote" legitimate targets in any definition of the word.
So, Joanna, I mean, if I step back for a second, I'm struck by how little folks outside of India and maybe even inside of India understand how big this story is, right? I mean, if you just drop this story in the United States and you found out that there was private software licensed only to governments, and that software is being used to target sitting judges, bureaucrats, opposition leaders, opposition political strategists. Like, this makes, Watergate look like a tea party, right? I mean, this is because when you control someone's smartphone, this isn't just hacking. It's not just that they're listening to our conversation or reading our emails. Our lives now are contained on our smartphones. This is your camera, it's your photos, it's your notes, it's really the totality of you almost. And so are you, as someone who worked doggedly on this story, what do you think about kind of the legs that it has? Because, nowadays in India anyway, it's kind of yesterday's news.
Well, I'm very interested to see what happens here. I don't think this is over yet, but it certainly is striking the way the government has managed to diffuse, put off, delay reckoning on this front, because you would expect that the government would want to know if Indian citizens had been targeted with spyware by someone other than their own government. That would be something they would be very interested in finding out. And they seem remarkably unperturbed by these allegations, by these revelations, which suggests that they are not unfamiliar, perhaps, with the source of this information. To your point about the kind of perniciousness of this software, spyware, absolutely. We live on our smartphones. If someone has full access to it, they can see everything you've been saying. They can turn your phone into a listening device. One of the more interesting moments in the reporting of this story came when I helped conduct the analysis of Prashant Kishore's phone. And so there was a way that we did this, and he and I were talking as this process was underway. And sometimes it would take a day for the results to come back. Sometimes they would come back quickly. And in this case, the results came back extremely quickly. It came back within half an hour, and it said, yes, this phone has been successfully targeted. And what's more, this phone shows signs of infection as recently as today. So here, we had been kind of chatting. I don't really recall what we had been chatting about, but certainly it was about Indian politics. And to know that who knows who might have been listening is a disconcerting experience. And really, throughout this project, we had to take a lot of precautions. As a result, we never conducted interviews with our phones in the room, things like that. It was extensive precautions on that front.
Your reporting on Pegasus dovetailed with another of your biggest stories called the Bhima Koregaon plot. I don't even know how to describe this, so I'm going to let you do it. I don't think this case is particularly well known outside of Indian circles, but suffice it to say, this was a story that you and your colleagues were chasing down for quite a long time. It entered a new chapter once the Pegasus revelations came to light. Could you tell us a bit about what's involved in this case? And then maybe as a secondary question, what Pegasus, how that entered the fray?
The Bhima Koregaon case is something that many more people should know about, and many more people outside India should know about. And for me personally, it occupies a big kind of space in my head, because it turns out that it is one of the first stories that I wrote about when I arrived back in India in 2018. I think it was maybe 2 or 3 weeks after I arrived. I wrote a story about Sudha Bharadwaj, who is a lawyer and trade unionist known for her work in Chhattisgarh. And she was arrested along with several other activists. She was accused of being part of a banned militant group, the CPIM, waging an insurgency against the government, the Maoists. So there was this group of activists arrested, and there were some fairly spectacular accusations made against them, including linking them to a plot to assassinate Prime Minister Modi. And these accusations were based on letters recovered from a laptop belonging to an activist who had been arrested months earlier. And these letters were strange. They used real names rather than code words. In several cases, they used Marathi spellings, and Sudha Bharadwaj doesn't speak Marathi. The activists vehemently denied the charges against them. And despite their lawyers' best efforts, they were not released on bail. So as a journalist just arriving back in India, this whole case caught my attention, and it seemed very strange and very weird. There was something wrong here, something wrong about these accusations, something wrong about this evidence. People had many suspicions, but no proof. So fast forward 2.5 years, my colleague Neha Mussey is approached by a source who wanted to discuss a forensic analysis that had been performed on these activists' computers by a company in Massachusetts. And that forensic analysis showed that these activists had been the targets of an organized, deliberate campaign to hack and compromise their computers. And the very same letters that were cited as incriminating evidence had been planted on these devices. So this is chilling stuff. This is actual planting of electronic evidence on people's computers. So we have clear evidence, clear signs that someone was targeting these activists with malware and trying to frame them. And we don't know who did that. So that's one basket, one side of the case. Now, meanwhile, during the exact same time period, we found out that the phone numbers of these same activists appear on the list of numbers that we were discussing earlier. So the list of numbers that may have been targeted with spyware that is sold only to governments. These activists are all in prison, so we were not able to analyze their mobile phones to determine, whether or not they were compromised. So this case is very, very troubling, on a number of levels. We know that a group of government critics was facing potential targeting with both a form of sophisticated spyware and a malicious hacking operation. And at the same time, again, Indian authorities appear remarkably unperturbed by either revelation. The National Investigation Agency is in charge of these cases. These computer forensic reports have been submitted to the courts. I can say that I've never quite encountered an investigating agency that appears less inclined to investigate. You would think that when a new piece of evidence emerges in a case, they would want to know whether this was true, but they seem, again, not inclined to follow up on this. So I think of all the kind of things that we've written about and covered over the last 3 years, the fact that these people are still in jail 3 years later is really, really very, very troubling. And of course, one of them, Father Stan Swami, Jesuit priest in his 80s with Parkinson's disease, who died this year after a prolonged spell in jail. So there are life and death consequences for whatever is happening here. And I certainly hope it gets more attention outside India.
So I don't want to sort of, depress all of our listeners, but I'd be remiss if I didn't ask you about another heartbreaking story, which is, of course, India's COVID second wave. Over the past, several months, we've had people come on the show to talk about the epidemiology, the economic consequences, the political ramifications. I wonder if you might just reflect as a kind of journalist, what it was like to cover the story. You, in a sense, were living in the middle of it. Undoubtedly, you had friends and others, colleagues who were affected. In fact, your colleague Neha Mussey, who you reported so many stories with, was on the show. She, of course, was personally affected. Several members of her family were seriously ill. But yet you had to go out and report what was happening and make sure that the world was getting a clear glimpse of the ground realities. Tell us a little bit about that experience.
Absolutely. So Neha has written very eloquently about what it was like to care for your own family and work as a journalist at the same time. I don't think anyone who was in India or in Delhi at that time probably I can say that I think everyone who lived through that period of time in India was changed by it. It was a very difficult and frightening period, and I had the ability to isolate myself and my kids as best as I could. I remember sitting on my bed on a Saturday evening and writing a brutal story about a hospital in Delhi running out of oxygen, having spoken to a hospital administrator who could not save his own colleague who was sick with COVID there. And then a week later, I found myself writing about the same thing happening again in Delhi, in the national capital. Many people were sick. Many people were dying. The experience of kind of going back and forth between reporting and writing, checking on people who were sick, trying to arrange help for friends or friends of friends or relatives of friends, or talking to your neighborhood association that was buying oxygen cylinders and concentrators, and then talking to people who had lost multiple members, of their family to COVID. There was a sense of collapse, and it was extremely extremely difficult, and I think compounded by the fact that whether through the sheer number of cases had kind of overwhelmed the government's ability to cope, and combined with the desire to minimize what was happening, we had to try to let people know the gravity of the situation, particularly where deaths were concerned, and that was not being reflected in the official statistics. So that was also a big focus of our efforts.
So, Joanna, I want to bring this conversation to a close by asking you a story, asking you a question rather about stories that may have occupied your brain space, but that you never had the time or the chance or the sourcing or the access or what have you to execute. And I'm just curious, now that you've left India, you're back in the United States, covering a completely different beat, the northeastern region of the United States. Are there stories that are still kind of sometimes, you think about thinking like, that was one that got away, or that someone needs to do, or that I'm waiting for my colleagues to hunt down? Are there any of those kind of still living inside your head?
One story that I never got to do, and I think it's one that I am in particular interested, is I have a particular kind of interest in, is I wanted to go back. So we started this conversation by talking about my initial stint in India when I was based in Mumbai. And so when I was there, I wrote a front page story for the Wall Street Journal about call center workers, and how this was not just an economic change, but a cultural change also for these young people who are living lives in many ways very different from their parents. So one story that I never got to do, or never got to finish, unfortunately, I wanted to follow up on some of these people 20 years later. I think it would be very interesting to see where their lives took them, and also might tell us something about the trajectory of India and its vaunted middle class in those years. So there are many stories on the list that never got done, but I think that's just the way it is, and who knows, maybe one day.
Well, you had a reporting stint, you had maternity leave, you had another reporting stint. So now for your book leave, you can go do the call center 2 decades later?
Well, I have to say I miss India very much. It's a place that is very dear to my heart, and I hope to get back there soon.
My guest on the show this week is Joanna Slater. She was the Washington Post India bureau chief based in New Delhi from 2018 to 2021. She's currently based in Massachusetts, where she covers the northeastern region of the United States for the Post. Joanna, thank you so much. It was great to hear your reflections, both on the process of what you do, the life as a journalist, as well as some of the big stories that you covered. I mean, it's kind of remarkable in preparing for this episode to go back and look at your catalog. You really were there during just this insanely dynamic and consequential time. And thanks so much for coming on the podcast.
Well, thank you for having me, for your thoughtful questions, and for your excellent and insightful work on so many of these same questions.
Grant Tamasha is a co-production of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace and the Hindustan Times. This podcast is an HT Smartcast original and is available on htsmartcast.com, India's fastest growing podcasting platform. You can also find us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, or wherever you get your podcasts. Don't forget to rate and review. Helps others find the show more easily. For more information about the show and to find the writing we reference on this week's episode, visit our website, granttamasha.com. Production assistance comes from Caroline Duckworth, Tim Martin is our audio engineer, and Cliff Jayapranada is our executive producer. Thanks for listening, and see you next week.
This was a Hindustan Times production brought to you by HT Smartcast.
HT Smartcast.